Today we are looking at the cardiovascular system. There are six main functions of the cardiovascular system which we will look at now. The first of which is nutrient delivery, so taking things like glucose from the intestines and supplying them to muscles and organs so that they have fuel available so they can keep working. Also, the CV system is responsible for the removal of waste products. So when muscle tissue works, it produces waste products like lactic acid and carbon dioxide, which need to be removed from these tissue sites. The CV system additionally transports oxygen, so it will take oxygen to the working muscles so that respiration can keep occurring. Clotting cuts is also a function of the CV system, so when you have a cut and you're losing blood, platelets are supplied to the area, which forms a scab, and these scabs help reduce blood loss and help us maintain the necessary levels of blood we have in our body. Also, there are white blood cells in the blood, which help protect us from infection. And finally, thermoregulation is the last function of the cardiovascular system, and this is done through vasoconstriction, vasodilation, and it allows us to either keep warm or increase our heat loss so that we can maintain our temperature and maintain homeostasis. So the CV system actually has two circulations. So one of them is from the right-hand side of the heart and pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And then when this blood returns to the left-hand side of the heart, it's pumped, and it's oxygenated blood, it's pumped around the body to the working muscles and to organs. So this is the heart anatomy. So as you can see here, there is the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, which bring deoxygenated blood into the right-hand side of the heart. This is the right atrium, and this is the right ventricle. And then what you have here is the aorta, which takes blood out of the left-hand side of the heart, so this being the left atrium and left ventricle. And then this is the left pulmonary artery. So blood comes out of the right-hand side through the pulmonary artery, up and around the heart to the lungs, and then it will come in through the left pulmonary veins here, which are the veins that have oxygenated blood in, unlike the rest of the veins in our body. And then also you have these chordae tendineae here, which help the valves function properly. The tricuspid valves on this side and then bicuspid valves on this side, which prevent backflow. So we maintain the blood flowing the correct direction of our system, which helps us maintain oxygen supply to our body, which is clearly a benefit. This is the myocardium you can see around here, which is the muscle tissue. So as you can see, the left-hand side of our heart is actually much thicker and has a lot more myocardium, which is because you need to be able to pump a lot more blood from this side of the body. Well, you need to be able to pump it further around the body, because the blood from this side only has to go to the lungs, which are quite near the heart, whereas the blood on this side has to go all the way around the body and to the working muscles. Then there are a series of other blood vessels, which we'll look at later. So the cardiac cycle is a process of one complete heartbeat, as it says here, and there are two stages, which is systole and diastole. So during systole, the myocardium contracts and forces blood out of the ventricles, and during relaxation, which is when passive filling occurs, this is called diastole, where the myocardium is at rest and blood moves passively between the atria and the ventricles. The total process lasts for approximately 0.8 seconds, so there is 0.5 seconds of passive filling and 0.3 seconds of contraction here. So the conduction system essentially works in this manner. The sinoatrial node emits a signal that will go through internodal pathways to the AV node, and these essentially spread across both atria, so they go through the right and left atria, and cause them to contract, forcing the blood that's passively filled into here down into the ventricles. This happens after some of the blood has already filled the ventricles. So initially, the atria fill passively, and when there's enough blood in the atria, 70% of it flows into the ventricles, and then the 30% that's left is forced out via atrial systole. So this is when the SA node actually begins to function and work as a pacemaker. So the SA node will emit the signal, and blood will go from the atria to the ventricles, and then the signal will reach the AV node, which is right here, and it will go down the septum so that it can contract from bottom to top, because if the blood was actually forced down, it wouldn't leave through the correct blood vessels. So the signal goes down the septum here, and it will go through the bundle of His, and it will go through right and left bundle branches, so it splits off into both ventricles, and spread through these Purkinje fibers, causing contraction from the bottom of the ventricles upwards to force blood out in the correct direction. So the conduction system controls the cardiac cycle of the heart, because the impulse from the SA node, or pacemaker node, starts the conduction system. And when the cardiac cycle occurs, this is because the impulses have taken effect on the myocardium and caused contraction, or there is a lack of impulses and relaxation is occurring. The autonomic nervous system also has an influence on the cardiac cycle, and this is because it controls the heart rate. So sometimes you need a higher heart rate and sometimes you need a lower heart rate, depending on if you're at work or at rest, or if you're in a warm place or a cold place, or if you have high levels of acid in your blood compared to low levels of acid in your blood. So if your heart rate needs to be increased, the sympathetic nervous system will send an impulse to the accelerator nerve, which will send an impulse to raise the speed at which your heart beats. If your heart rate needs to be decreased, for example, you've stopped exercising and less oxygen is needed at working muscles, the parasympathetic nervous system is stimulated, and it stimulates the vagus nerve, which then causes the heart rate to be decreased. There are also ways that hormones can affect the cardiac cycle. For example, adrenaline can be released into the bloodstream as a reaction to needing an increased heart rate, which stimulates an increase in heart rate. So the ANS is actually influenced by this. So the medulla oblongata is where the cardiac control center is stored. And so the vagus nerve is actually in here, so the parasympathetic nervous system. And then you can see here that the sympathetic cardiac nerves are stored throughout the spine. And they send impulses to the SA node and to the AV node and to the ventricular myocardium. So this will cause emissions of impulses and reception of impulses, and cause also contraction of the myocardium. So now we're going to look at blood and its structure and its function. So first of all, blood has different roles for different parts of blood, and there are also different vessels which do different things. So here you have red blood cells, or erythrocytes, which are responsible for essentially transporting oxygen as their main task. And they contain hemoglobin, which is what oxygen bonds to. Then here you have platelets, which are responsible of clotting in damaged areas to reduce blood loss, which we looked at. You also have white blood cells, or leukocytes, which are responsible for fighting against disease and infection, keeping us healthy. And you have plasma, which essentially carries solids and is the majority of our blood. So here you can see that our blood's made up of 55% plasma, and then you have white blood cells and platelets making up less than 1%, and then red blood cells make up 45%. However, in different people, the ratio can change slightly. So if you are a long distance or an endurance athlete who's trained at high altitudes, your red blood cell production will be increased, and you'd actually have a higher percentage of red blood cells compared to the rest of the ratio of your blood. And then here you can see plasma is made up of 90% water, so it's very important we stay hydrated so that we can maintain the levels of blood we have in our body. And it's also 8% protein, so it takes around various proteins that are needed to rebuild muscle and keep us healthy. Then you have white blood cells and platelets making up less than 1% of the blood in the body. And then red blood cells are actually 97% hemoglobin. So they are purely based around transporting oxygen, really. Like it's quite clear that their main purpose is definitely the transport of oxygen. And then you have red and white blood cells also containing protein. So while they are mainly focused on fighting diseases or transporting oxygen, depending on which they are, they also have other roles that they need to fulfill. So here you can see there are 5 different types of blood vessels. So you have arteries that go to arterioles, that lead to capillary beds, that lead to venules, that lead to veins. And they have different structures and functions as well. So the arteries, common here, and they have thick walls and an elastic layer to deal with high pressure and a high velocity of blood, so that when blood is pumped out of the heart, these are capable of stretching and not bursting, and can therefore deal with this high pressure. They are also controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, and they take blood away from the heart to the working muscles. So in nearly every artery, you're dealing with oxygenated blood. However, there is the pulmonary artery which has deoxygenated blood. Then you have arterioles, which you can see here have these, there are precapillary sphincters here, which help keep the blood going to the correct places so they can contract and restrict the flow of blood to certain capillary beds. And then you also see there's smooth muscle cells on the outside that are capable of contracting and restricting flow to certain areas. So this is part of our vasoconstriction, vasodilation. So arterioles are smaller branches of arteries, and they're very important in deciding where our blood flows. They're also the main regulators of blood flow and blood pressure. So they can increase blood pressure by contracting more, by having the smooth muscle cells contract. And if they dilate, then blood pressure is reduced. And then you have capillaries, which are the smallest, and they come in between arterioles and venules. So capillaries are typically 1 cell thick, and they tend to transport, well, they tend to be around muscle sites or tissue sites, like organs, where it's necessary for gaseous exchange to occur, so they'll also be at the lungs. So oxygen can come across each way through the cell. So, for example, the lungs take in air, and the oxygen would pass from the lungs across one cell in the lungs through the capillary cell and then enter our bloodstream there. Or carbon dioxide would do the opposite. Then you have venules, which are essentially just there to take blood away from the capillaries, and they take it towards the veins. So there are venules here, which have a tunica externa and an endothelium, but they don't have smooth muscle tissue, and they aren't very elastic. They tend to be dealing with blood at low pressure, and they don't have a lot of ways of increasing the pressure. And then you have veins, which are looked at. They have smooth muscle tissue, so this helps venous return, and they have connective tissue, but they also, large veins, have valves to prevent backflow, and they transport blood towards the heart, and they have a large lumen which allows easy blood flow. Also, arteries have a large lumen too, because they need to be able to allow blood to pass through. Veins are also helped by the muscle pump, so our muscles contract on either side of our veins, and it forces blood through the veins back to the heart, and it increases venous return. So here what you can see is a chart that has arteries here, showing the diameter of their lumen being 4 millimeters across here, which is significantly larger than the arteriole, capillary, and venule. Then the vein has the lumen diameter of 5 millimeters, which is actually larger because it allows easier blood flow. Also, the arteries have high amounts of elastic tissue, which you can see arterioles, capillaries, and venules all lack. And it has the highest amount of smooth muscle tissue, so that it's more capable of contraction, keeping blood flowing. And it also has high levels of fibrous tissue. Whereas arterioles have quite a small lumen and do not have any elastic tissue, so they aren't capable of dealing with blood at as high a pressure as an artery. They do have smooth muscle tissue, as we discussed, because they're capable of vasodilation and vasoconstriction, which helps us control where the blood goes to. Then capillaries do not have any of these features, as they're only 1 cell thick and are essentially used for gaseous exchange. Then venules don't have elastic tissue or smooth muscle tissue either, and they're very, very thin, but they do have an endothelium and fibrous tissue. And then veins actually have elastic tissue as well, so they're capable of expanding and stretching, and it also means they can snap back and increase the pressure behind the blood and force it through. They also have smooth muscle tissue, so that they can help the muscle pump work and increase venous return and get more blood back to our hearts so we can pump around the body, and they also feature fibrous tissue. And so here you can see arteries send blood from the heart around the body, veins send blood to the heart from around the body, and capillaries exchange blood with tissues. So the pressure in arteries is high, in veins it's low and it's essentially oozing through, and in capillaries it's low. So this helps gaseous exchange as blood spends more time next to the tissue that it's meant to be next to. So it will ooze past the lungs slowly so a lot of oxygen can pass into it. With wall thickness, the arteries are very thick because they need to be able to deal with high pressure, whereas veins are thin because they deal with low pressure, and capillaries are very thin so the things can pass through. And here you can see what these are made out of. So they have the three layers, and only one layer because they're very thin. Also, there are muscle tissues in high amounts in arteries, small amounts in veins, and then none in capillaries, because these are for transporting high pressure, whereas these are for low pressure, and these are just for gaseous exchange.